Today I'm going to take you through the steps that I went through to create a pond in my concrete garden without having to lift up any of the concrete. It's a really quick process and you can even get it done in a weekend or so if you've got that sort of time. But I decided to leave it a few months before I posted this video just so that I could show you how the pond has progressed over that time. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been watching my videos as well as leaving comments during the time that I've been gone. I've been really busy with work and also with writing a book that I'm trying to get done. So I haven't had as much time to film these videos as I would have liked, but I do have some that will be coming out soon. Anyway, let's get on with the process. Step 1 of my process was to varnish and assemble the frame. I bought a frame kit, but you could also customise the size that you want just by buying some planks of wood and nailing them together. Also, if you have any sort of pre-made container, like a large planter or a sink, then that could work too. The wood for this frame wasn't really prepared in any particular way, so I used the varnish to give it a bit of added protection from the elements and to increase how long it would last in the garden. I decided to build this pond in the concrete part of my garden because I wanted a bit more life in that patch and I didn't want to disturb the invertebrate community that was in my soil. At the moment, my garden is mostly covered by concrete or by bits of gravel, and I'm trying really hard to take care of the areas that are more natural, so I didn't want to risk disturbing them by digging up a pond and accidentally getting rid of the nature that I do have. Putting together the frame was a little bit fiddly, but once I'd figured it out, it was okay. Step 2 was to put the frames together. Because it came in a kit, I didn't get any say in the height. So for the pond to have any value to wildlife, you need to have a mixture of deep and shallow areas. My solution was basically to just stack 2 of the frames on top of each other to have enough height to play with those different depths. You can tell by my coat that this was much earlier in the year than this video is coming out. I started this process in February because I wanted my pond to properly establish itself by the time the growing season came around in spring and summer. The plan is that by autumn there's enough vegetation around and inside the pond that it'll be nicely sheltered over winter, and then come next spring hopefully it'll be an attractive place for the invertebrates and the amphibians. Luckily, the kind of fitting that's attached to all of these corners means that the planters can stack on top of each other nicely, and I didn't need to mess around with adding any other attachments. Step 3 was to create the lining for the frame. I actually recorded this process at the time, but I was midway through renovating the room that I was in, and it was so echoey that the audio basically couldn't be salvaged. So you'll probably notice me chatting away through some of these next few clips, but you're not missing much because it's all just a bit of a garbled blur. The frames that I bought came with these raised bed liners that are normally used for if you're planting vegetables or wildflowers in some soil inside a container rather than down in the ground. There's a tab on each of the corners to hold them in place, and there was also tiny holes at the bottom. It was a really great feature that I was looking for because it means that the soil around the pond can hold the moisture for plants to grow, but won't become too waterlogged if the plant starts overflowing when it rains. The way that I went about creating my liner was a little bit fiddly. Because I had those 2 different frames that I'd stacked on top of each other, the liners that I bought weren't actually the right depth for the pond that I wanted to create. So I had to cut a big hole out of the bottom of one of them and then attach the sides that were left to the top of the undamaged lining. This made sure that it was the right width and length, and then I was able to change the height to match what I wanted. It did end up being a bit of a mess, but part of the reason that I like creating these instructional videos is to show you the reality of wildlife gardening. Not everything's going to look perfect and work out exactly as you planned, but so long as it gets the job done, then I reckon that that's good enough. Step 4 is very important. Clear out the base of the pond. You don't want the lining and everything else to be resting on sharp stones that could pierce the pond liner and then cause a leak. Step 5 is to attach your raised bed liner to the frame. This isn't what's going to hold the water, so it doesn't matter if there are gaps like there are in mine. The main thing is that it's attached well enough that it's not going to fall down when you start filling the frame. This is where the tabs on my liners came in really handy because they were able to latch onto the bottom, middle and the top of the frames at each of the corners, and it held it nice and securely. Step 6 is to fill the liner with soil. I'd recommend choosing the soil type that best matches whatever plants you're going to be using around your pond, but make sure that whatever you choose is peat-free. The UK only has around 20% of our peatlands left, and this habitat cools the atmosphere, it helps prevent floods, and it supports a whole range of unique species, so it's really important to preserve it. I'm really glad to see that my local garden centres have stopped, for the most part, selling peat-based compost and make sure to label all of their compost as peat-free. It's far better off to just leave the peat where it is naturally, rather than randomly scattering it in gardens for plants that don't need it. The way that I filled this bed was in multiple stages. So I started with the base layer, which would mean that my pond had something soft to rest on. Then I added in more where I wanted the steep sides to go, and then I shaped the shallow areas. If you mould a pond with different levels of depth, then you'll be able to support a much bigger range of wildlife than if it's just one depth all round. I built a really shallow step with a ramp going all the way down to the deep end, as well as another step partway up to provide another depth of shelf. I wasn't sure at this stage how well the shape in the soil was going to hold, but my only option was to find out, so I went on to step 7 and got the pond liner in. This is what's going to hold your water, so make sure you're choosing a material that's actually waterproof. If you have a watertight container, then you could use that instead of and not mould the shape yourself. But the trickiest part of the process if you are moulding it yourself is this step, because you're going to need to keep the shape that you want without stretching or sagging the material. I tried to make sure that it stayed folded over in the troughs in the soil so that the ends weren't flapping about everywhere. In the end, I decided on a this is enough for now kind of mindset, and I figured I'd finish the rest when the material was held in place rather than when it was fighting me. Step 8 is to start filling the pond with water. Now it's best to use rainwater for a garden pond, and you can collect this with a water butt in your garden. If you're not sure what that is, I have got a guide that explains it, and it also explains other wildlife-friendly things that you can have in your garden. That's for sale in my shop, and I'll leave a link in the video description below. Of course, if you don't have rainwater, you can still use tap water, but you'll need to let it stand for a few days, otherwise the chemicals could harm your wildlife. Adding in this water meant that my liner was actually staying in place, so I was able to finish those final placements of the sides. With the pond half full, I could finally see whether my shaping of the soil had worked. It had shifted slightly, but for the most part it held up, which was really exciting. I then continued to fill the pond and adjust the edges of the liner as it shifted. Once the pond was completely filled, you could see where all the rough edges were. Because this was my first attempt, I wasn't really surprised that it didn't perfectly line up at the water level, but like I said, so long as it's functional, it's fine to me. And as you can already see, there's an insect flying around it investigating the new water. Step 9 is to add in some functional decorative features. I purchased these colourful rocks to scatter around. I partly chose them because they would help the pond look nice, but it was mostly for their function. The rocks helped keep the liner in the right place, and they also formed a slope out of the water in the shallow end, and this could help tiny animals if they fall in or they want to reach down for a drink. With the stones newly in place, you could really see the different levels under the water, and how even something like a little bee could sit on a stone and get a drink. Step 10 is to add in some exterior plants. I've been experimenting this year with growing some native wildflowers from seeds, and a lot of these experiments have been successful, so I decided to use the new plants that I had to decorate the outside of my pond. So in March, that's what I did. Technically it was a bit too early, and I knew that these plants would have to deal with frost if I put them out, but my philosophy with gardening is if it survives then great, but if not, oh well. So I got to work taking my plants out of their little pots, making sure that their roots were healthy enough, and then positioning them around the pond. They look so cute and tiny scattered around the border, but as you'll see towards the end of the video, they actually spread really quickly and fill out the space. Step 11 is completely optional, but I wanted to put up some camera traps to keep an eye on my new pond. I was off to Scotland for a week in March, so I thought it was the perfect opportunity to see what my garden visitors were up to and what they thought of this new feature. The very first visitors to my pond were the bravest residents of my garden, a magpie and a robin. They each spent a good amount of time investigating the pond and picking up the food from around it. Watching them on the camera trap was really great, especially when the pond iced over, because I got to watch as the robin was hopping around on the surface. Although none of the birds came down during the snow, it was a good test to see that my pond was able to actually withstand snow and ice and could make it through the other side safely. This gives me great hope that it'll survive through the winter as well. It wasn't just my birds that were making use of the pond though. In this video on the right hand side you can see a fly using the sides of the box as a perch. Invertebrates will need a place to land as well so that they can breed and eat. A pond can be a really good site for all of that and helps support all of the wildlife that eats those invertebrates. I then waited a couple of weeks before I moved on to step 12 because I wanted to let the water settle and to make sure that I hadn't accidentally punctured the lining or something and that the pond wasn't slowly draining away. Only once I knew that it was safe and it was all functioning okay, that's when I decided to add in some pond plants. If you've watched my other gardening videos, you'll know that there are various zones in a pond which different plants are suited to. These plants all have their different jobs, but it's important to buy ones that are the right ones for the space that you have. I decided to go for a purple iris because it can sit in the shallow water. I also got a Bacopa caroliniana and a red stem myriophyllum because they're both oxygenators and they can sit in the deep water. If you really want your wildlife to thrive in the pond, then you need to get some way for them to have oxygen within the water. I also got Equisetum japonicum because mostly I just like how it looks. Step 13 is to add ways in and out of your pond. Because of where mine's situated, there are a variety of planters around that can act as stepping stones. However, more is always helpful. I found this big branch lying about in my garden and decided to actually make use of it by making a perch for the pond. It didn't take very long for a couple invertebrates to show up, probably brought in with the new plants. Step 14 is another optional step. I wanted to practice my pond building, and so I added an extension onto this one. I went through all of the same steps, except this time I decided to make a smaller but deeper pond. I did still keep the shallow ramp at one end so that the small animals could get out. Then I added a couple more plants around both the ponds to make them appear more cohesive as one unit. I only finished this final step in June, which was when I added in another oxygenating plant. This time I went for a rotala to add a little bit of variety to the whole area. I only got this one plant because of this smaller pond and I didn't want to overwhelm it with multiple of them. Step 15 is to monitor your pond. We get some very high winds here and I had to go out and put my plants back in their proper spots a couple of times. Over time the plants did grow and hold themselves where they're meant to be, but for the first few weeks you'll need to tend to it to make sure it can get to that point. And finally, the last step, 16. This is to simply enjoy your pond. Watch it over the next few months as your pond slowly grows and transforms. By June, my pond looked much more lively with lots of plants that managed to survive and grow. I hope that over time it can become a place my local birds can come and find shelter from the summer heat. I'd love to know in the comments what you think about my pond, and if you decide to make one similar to mine, then let me know how it goes.